Alan Fogel with the Canadian Energy Research Institute. We are presenting a webinar on electricity storage, applications and business cases. We're going to start in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for some people to join the webinar. Just a reminder that you can select two different types of audio, either mic and speakers using VoIP or telephone, and there are call-in numbers that are identified on the front slide of your presentation. While we're waiting, I'd just like to
say thank you to the Ontario Energy Association for working with us on presenting this material. The Ontario Energy Association has been in discussions with CERI about bringing more information to your members, and this is just the start of the process. And when we get to the end, there's a question in a survey we'd like people to fill out, and one of those questions is about what sort of future research topics you would like to see presented, either through this forum or actual research to be conducted by the Institute. I just wanted to, just before we start again, talk about how you can participate on the webinar through audio, mics and speakers using VoIP, or through telephone using the dial-up information. Questions can be submitted through the question panel. These are text questions. I'll read the questions and then be providing an answer to them, or if I'm not able to provide the answer now, we will follow up with answers at a later date. A copy of this presentation can be downloaded, but we'll also be sending out a copy with the emails to participants, also asking them to fill out a survey about their views related to this webinar. Okay, we'll start the webinar. I just wanted to give a little bit of background about the Canadian Energy Research Institute. We are a not-for-profit charitable organization. We have a number of funders that keep us going, including the Alberta government, the federal government, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, as well as the provinces of British Columbia and Saskatchewan, the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada, Alberta Industrial Heartland, University of Calgary, Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, the Ivy Foundation, and the SM Blair Family Foundation. These donors are helping CERI to maintain and continue to produce high quality research, looking at various questions that the energy industry in Canada is considering in oil, gas, and electricity. And in this case, we're talking about electricity. The Institute has been in existence since 1975. We're celebrating our 45th year. We have a number of market studies that are on our website. Those are free, and they go back to 2010. There's information there relating to upstream and midstream and downstream activities in oil, gas, and electricity. In addition, CERI hosts a series of events, including this webinar, and an annual petrochemicals conference that happens in June. So what we're going to be talking about today is energy storage, or in particular electricity storage. And we're looking at 3 different applications: behind the fence, so this is in terms of load management. We're going to be looking at energy arbitrage and renewable energy firming. We'll be talking about each of those in sequence, and then with some final conclusions about where the cost effectiveness of energy storage or electricity storage is going in the future. The news is almost constantly talking about various types of energy storage as it relates to managing the electricity system. And there's been significant amount of investment in this sector over the last number of years, and that's only likely to increase. The challenge right now is that in a lot of jurisdictions, the price of electricity is reasonably cheap. Some might say in Ontario it's a little bit more expensive than in other jurisdictions, but yet it is cheap enough that the cost of energy storage these days can be challenging, and it only depends on some specific aspects of the application where it actually does make sense. As you're probably aware, storage applications can range across a number of options. In this case, we're looking at behind the meter applications, so bill management, power quality backup, and also bulk energy services related to arbitrage and capacity. And in this case, we're talking about capacity in terms of firming up intermittent renewable energy. While you'll see a lot of the discussion going on in the media today talking about batteries, there is a range of storage options for different applications. And you can see on this slide where we've tried to identify most of the various options available. And it depends on the type of storage that is being looked for. So responsive services in the short term, you can see here we're talking a lot about batteries and supercapacitors. If you're looking at bulk management in a longer time frame, you're looking at some flow batteries, compressed air, cryogenic storage, hydrogen fuel cells, and pumped hydro storage. So what we wanted to do was just take a look at where the technologies are now and an outlook of where their costs are going, and then consider 3 main applications for storage in Canada, looking at, as I said before, bill management. That's a spelling mistake there, sorry about that. Bulk energy arbitrage, so it's really what brokers and arbiters are doing, and renewable energy firming. Now, the way we analyze these is through different financial tests. For the first 2, we're looking at internal rate of return, so it's purely a financial analysis. And in the third one, we're looking at the levelized cost of electricity to see if firming using storage is more or less cost effective than other options. Now there's a range of technologies, as I mentioned. Just want to draw your attention over to the thermal side. You'll see low temperature, cryogenic, for example, and that should be high temperature below that. And these are things like phase change materials and concrete storage plants, where we're talking about higher temperature. Those technologies aren't as well defined as the more mechanical ones, and the short-term and capacitor technologies, as well as the electrochemical ones, the batteries, lithium-ion being a particular one. But they are still coming along, and there's still a lot of research and a lot of innovation that's being done in all these areas. Now, one of the things we're finding with energy storage technologies is the fact that we're still seeing a rapid reduction in capital costs. This is following a similar maturity curve that we've seen with renewable energy technologies such as wind and solar, where the capital costs have come down significantly. But we're also seeing that in, for example, utility scale lithium ion battery storage could see a decline of almost half by 2030. So we're looking at if it's not economic right now, it could be economic in the near term. This is the cost curve we've been able to develop based on our assessment of how technologies are maturing. And you can see that pumped hydro and compressed air are going to stay relatively stable in terms of costs out for the foreseeable future. Hydrogen fuel cells, however, flow batteries, lithium ion batteries, and even lead acid batteries, those costs are going to come down. When you're talking about some significant improvements, the flow batteries are tending to come down into a very less expensive range, and they, at least in terms of the utility scale operations, could actually be a replacement for the broader convention that lithium ion batteries will be playing a significant role there. So the first one we were looking at was bill management. So we're talking about behind the meter, where large customers are using storage to offset peak charges. And those people in Ontario know better than anyone else that peak charges are a significant portion of the bill. If these can be avoided, there's a significant financial contribution that can be made using an investment in storage. So when we're talking about here at the last point about shaving peak demands using energy storage or through shifting operations of various production processes. Now, sometimes that's not possible with some commercial and industrial activities because they have to produce during the day and can't move off peak, but in some cases, some of these operations can. And if we're looking at which is cheaper, energy storage versus on peak versus off peak, that depends on how much can be moved to off peak, and also depends on what the cost of the energy storage systems are. So demand charge reductions are the key here. We're looking at trying to shave the peak demands using energy storage and moving storing the energy during off-peak powers and discharging it when it's needed, especially in a peak hour or a peak period during the day. As long as the rate design allows for that peak demand shifting and reducing the bills associated with peak demand charges, these will work. In those jurisdictions where that's not possible, where it's more of a fixed charge regardless of your peak requirement for the system, the cost effectiveness of behind the meter energy storage is significantly impacted. So when we looked at the different applications for customers using behind the meter, we tried to focus on the commercial side, and this should be 5 types, not 4. You can see that we're talking about secondary schools, hotels, hospitals, and large and small office buildings. And we focused on 5 of the provinces due to the availability of information. Lithium ion storage is a very good option there. And in this case, that's what we used as our analysis. And we're trying to estimate what the internal rate of return is when you're looking at the costs of storage relative to the cost of your electricity bill. Another thing to keep in mind is, of course, sizing of the storage. Too big and you are not using the storage to full capacity, too small and you're leaving some money on the table. In this case, we're looking at a secondary school in Alberta in 2025. So keep in mind that the lithium-ion battery costs are going down. And we see that an internal rate of return of 17%, which is very significant, can be had if you're sizing a storage system so it has a energy component of 24 kilowatt hours and a power storage of 48 kilowatts. Now, when we compared the energy system storage costs to different applications across different provinces, you can see that the internal rate of return, at least in the initial stages, is low. So we're talking about less than 10%. However, that improves over time as the cost of the storage options decreases. And you can see by roughly 2025, except for the provinces of BC and Saskatchewan, that the internal rate of return is in the range that's acceptable for most applications. We still see some issues in Ontario for the next 5 years in terms of the cost effectiveness, and you can look and see that only by the time you get to 2030 does the internal rate of return for the different applications on the commercial side raise to the level that's acceptable. So, in concluding remarks related to the behind the meter storage, we see that the lithium-ion batteries are still the technology of choice. These may change as some of the new technologies improve, in particular in terms of flow batteries, but we're still not at that point where those play a significant threat to lithium-ion batteries. The low profile, as I mentioned before, is a key element. If there is demand charges that can be avoided through energy storage systems, then it makes sense. If those demand charges can't be avoided, then the storage is not necessarily cost effective because the cost of the energy itself is not large enough to support a significant investment in some of these storage systems. So the utility rate structure and the profile are very important. So generally speaking, where in a lot of cases you will find that energy storage is not cost effective, meaning it's not higher than a 10% internal rate of return. In some cases it can be, and of course it's improving every year. So the next one we wanted to look at was bulk energy arbitrage. So this is buying low and selling high. And in this case, we wanted to use a market that was quite open, where we had a lot of information to identify whether or not these arbitrage opportunities exist for various firms or companies or even customers of electricity. And we've evaluated compressed air, flow batteries, and lithium-ion batteries. And again, we're looking at an internal rate of return estimation to see if the financial benefits are there for the investment. What you see here is the observed electricity prices for Alberta. These are to a certain extent lower than what you would observe in Ontario. But in order to get the level of detail we needed to do this arbitrage, we focused on Alberta. The principles would be the same in other jurisdictions, although the analysis would have to be done separately. Now, what we found was that right now, it's not cost effective to be looking at energy arbitrage as the sole purpose reason for doing these investments. Now, one point to keep in mind is while we looked at these investments in isolation of individual services, so for example, behind the meter and arbitrage separately, if the values or services were stacked, that would make a difference. So if one were to say, well, we can look at bill management as an investment and that passes the internal rate of return, then the capital costs associated with that investment do not have to apply to energy arbitrage, and therefore the rate of return calculations would be much different. So one thing to consider when looking at behind the meter applications is, are there other services that can be provided with that same investment? And that would depend on, again, the load profile of the customer to see if the arbitrage opportunities and the load profile requirements are not coincident. If they are coincident, you are not able to combine those services. If they aren't coincident, then you are. There's still a lot of debate about capacity payments. Alberta was looking at the capacity market and has ceased moving in that direction, so it's an energy-only market. That means the capacity payments would not be available. Ontario is considering capacity in various forms, and so there is an opportunity there for some capacity payments to be made. It's not certain, and we didn't go into a lot of details about capacity markets and capacity payments as part of this overall analysis. So, as you saw with the internal rate of return values, the lithium ion batteries do not provide an attractive investment. If arbitrage is the sole service that's being provided for these investments. If there's some stacking of services, that's a different story. And it could be quite helpful to behind the meter customers if they can gain additional revenues and additional value out of their behind the meter investments. The last area we looked at was renewable energy firming. One of the key concerns in terms of electricity system planning is, of course, the intermittency of renewable power. Although the capacity values for wind and solar are increasing, they are still, even in the best of circumstances, no more than about 40%. And that means being able to firm up that power provides additional value to renewable investments. As I mentioned before, when we look at the resource availability, we're talking about upwards of 40% for wind and 12 to 16% that were used in this analysis, but some of the more recent information talks about upwards of 20%, and some of the new technologies that aren't yet in operation are in the 20 to 25% range. And for this analysis, we looked at lithium-ion and flow batteries, as well as hydrogen fuel cells. So in that case, hydrogen is created through the electrolysis of water and from the surplus power, and then the hydrogen is used to power a fuel cell. Again, in this case, differently in this case, we are looking at the levelized cost of electricity to see what it means in terms of the next available option for firming that power. So on this chart, you can see the different overall costs in levelized cost of electricity over the time period. We can see that the levelized cost of reductions of up to 22% by 2030 and 32% by 2040 are possible with the maturing of the technologies. But these costs are still significant, and they need to be compared next to the next available resource. But one of the things that we looked at was some of the locational issues with the lowest LCOE for Ontario, and with the batteries, we see that the storage energy time periods fluctuate much more significantly than the hydrogen fuel cells do, and this is over a 2-week period in the summer. So considering the different attributes related to storage services, we're looking at it both in terms of intraday and interday. And intraday, you're really looking at batteries, and interday, you're looking at hydrogen fuel cells that can store the energy for longer periods of time. Now, we've indicated that compressed air storage can potentially provide long-term energy storage, but those cases are quite unique and require significant, in this case, we're looking at underground compressed air storage. They need significant geologies to make sure that these systems can be cost effective and actually operated safely, because in some of these cases, we're talking about compressed air storage being operated in an old oil or gas reservoir, and there is the concern related to the mixing of compressed air and fumes from the residual oil or gas. Now, we went through a little bit of detail on the compressed air storage systems in order to really understand whether or not we see some significant benefits associated with compressed systems over time. The jury's still out in terms of whether or not these compressed air systems can be cost effective, mostly because we're still learning how to use the compressed air in these storage caverns. But if there is a similar improvement in technology and technology learning in compressed air options relative to hydrogen storage and relative to battery storage, then these could be an option. When we consider the renewable energy with storage and being able to produce 100% emissions-free electricity, we even included the costs associated with carbon taxes to see if it made much of a difference with the levelized cost of electricity under using the storage to firm up renewable energy. Depending on the province, there are some improvements that can be made. Levelized cost reductions of up to 22% by 2030 and 32% by 2040. However, because natural gas is very inexpensive, it still is the technology option to beat. So whereas the storage options right now are not lower in cost in relative to natural gas combined cycle, with improvements in the technologies, they could be in the 2030 to 2040 time period. So one of the things that I wanted to leave with you is the potential for storage in the future. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done on the technology side in terms of reducing the capital cost. There are currently likely a small subset of applications where these technologies can be cost effective, but on an overall basis, there's still some challenges associated with the cost. Part of it's due to the technology improvements that need to be made, but part of it's due to the fact that in most jurisdictions, we're looking at very low alternative costs with natural gas. Now in Ontario, with a lot of the market tied up with contracts, that also means that some of these costs are not avoidable. And so when you look at some of the costs associated with renewable energy firming, the application of storage is not necessarily cost effective for those producers. At this point, we're open to questions, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you have. If you can type your questions into the question panel as they come up, I will read them out and provide the answers to them. While I'm waiting for questions, let me know what you think about this webinar and what you'd like to hear in future CERI presentations. We're going to be sending an email to all the participants with a link to the survey, a link to the presentation, including questions about what people would like to see in terms of future research. Just so you're aware, the full report regarding this analysis and from which this presentation was taken is on our website at ceri.ca, and there's a lot more detail in there, including how we calculated the various numbers in the different provinces and what our assumptions are. There's still a little ways to go in terms of technology improvements, but I think one of the things I'd like to stress is that some of these technologies may be cost effective today in certain circumstances, and definitely when you consider services, more than one service for the investment. Some of our upcoming events you'll see here. We have a webinar on the role of rail in Canada's crude and petrochemical markets, which is very topical. Oh, sorry, there's a question here. How were the internal rates of return increases determined? Is it solely based on the declining cost curves of the storage type, or is there other factors involved? Well, the principal other factor involved is, of course, the cost of capital. We use a weighted average cost of capital of 10%, which roughly translates into an equity requirement of 12%. So that was the other main thing. We also looked at, of course, the savings that would be incurred based on the new investment. So that's part of the overall cost calculation. One other point to raise in terms of these upcoming events, while we have breakfast overviews in Edmonton and Calgary, and we've done one in Toronto and in other cities, we'd like to be in the Ontario market and providing some more of this information. So if you're interested at all in these breakfast overviews in a face-to-face setting, let your folks at the Ontario Energy Association know, and we can work with them on doing something in person in the Toronto or Ottawa regions. One other area that this group might be interested in is we are working right now on opportunities for distributed generation in Canada, looking at how new distributed generation investments fare in terms of their economics, as well as how they impact distribution systems operations. We have a presentation on that in March in Calgary, but we'd be more than happy to do something similar for the folks in Ontario and in Toronto at a later date. While we're not seeing any other questions, I will just wrap up then and say thank you for joining us. If you have any other questions, please send us an email at info@ceri.ca and we'll get back to you directly. If you want to talk more about other issues, you can reach us through that email address as well. And we're more than happy to talk about these projects and other things we've done in terms of electrification, cost of transmission, the impact of carbon capture and storage on our energy systems. We've got a variety of topics that we've dealt with that people might be interested in. If there are no other questions, thank you very much and have a good day.